I will start recording, and congratulations on making it to the last lecture of the semester. Okay, let me start sharing my screen share application. Okay, so we have one lecture to finish off, and then another one to get through. Okay, so we'll do the best we can. And you saw I put a message out maybe an hour ago or something like that, just confirming that we have our review session tomorrow. Okay, at 5 p.m. Friday. So what I'm asking there, I think what I'll do is I'll just go through lecture by lecture. In the lecture component folder of Blackboard, at the bottom, I put revision notes. That tells you which lectures are included, okay? Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat stuff there. iClicker open. No, iClicker is not open. I said on Tuesday that that was going to be the last day, okay? So no iClicker today. So what I'll do is I'll go through like lecture by lecture, and I'll pull up the PowerPoints, and it makes it much easier for me if you have specific questions. You know, I'll make it basically open mic kind of session. So if there are things you're not sure about, we can raise them, we can discuss them. It just makes it much easier if you organize that. So you sort of say, oh, in, you know, chapter so-and-so on slide so-and-so, there was something I confused by. We can just pull out that slide and then discuss through that relevant section. That makes it much easier, okay? So I think that's the way that we'll do it on Friday, okay? And I'll record it, so if you can't make it, you know, you can watch it later. If you've got special questions and you can't make it to the session, drop me an email and I'll do the best I can. Somebody else was asking when the final is. It is on Thursday at 11 a.m. Okay, I'll clarify that in the announcements as well. But that's a time set by the college. Okay. Okay. So last time we got to this slide here, we were talking about successions of different communities. Okay, is it divided into sections? Yes, there'll be 4 separate tests, just like in it'll be very similar to midterm 2. Okay, I will put an announcement about that. I'll let you know, and I'll let you know how the lectures are organized. Okay, probably in test 1 and test 2, some of the lectures, test 3 and test 4, some of the other lectures. Okay, so it'll be very similar. Dividing it into 4 gives you breaks between tests. It also means that if your test, you know, if you get a technical glitch and I have to reset somebody's test, you don't have to start on, you know, question number 52 and start all over again. Okay, the most you'll have to do will be the small number of questions in that test, which will either be 14 or 15 per test. I will clarify that. Good. Okay. Successions of communities, right? So we talked about primary successions, and the example we had there was Glacier Bay, where you got a glacier that has been sitting in the valley, and as it recedes, it allows colonization of that area. And primary succession occurs when basically that glacier has eliminated everything that's living there, right? Secondary succession is a similar type of event, but a bit less drastic. So it refers to the re-establishment of a community when most, but not all organisms are destroyed, okay? As opposed to the glacier that destroyed everything, this is a sort of a step back from that. So an example of that is, for example, something like a hurricane that might move through a forest and just, like, you know, rip down pine tree forests are particularly vulnerable to hurricanes, etc., leaving all this bare area underneath that can be recolonized. Or forest fires as well, which can move through, and there are certain types of trees that are especially, and other plants that are especially adapted to those conditions and actually need fire in order for their seeds to germinate. So this was an example, and I gave a link to where I got this from in the notes section of the slide that shows an example of succession of communities after a forest fire in a New Mexico area, where initially you get so-called ephemerals moving in. So these are pioneer plants, things like wildfires and so-called weeds that will move in somewhere. And you can think of these as being like our strategists, right? When we were talking about the populations. These types of organisms that have an R strategist lifestyle, that are quickly reproducing, but are not necessarily very good competitors. So they can move quickly in to these areas. After a while, grasses might take over from them. So they take over from weeds because they're better drought tolerant. And so they're better competitors under these drought conditions, eliminating the weeds. Then eventually that'll be taken over by scrub trees, which are larger and they're more resistant to grazers because they're unpalatable. And they're also good at colonizing nutrient-poor soil. So some of them might be nitrogen fixers, for example, as we talked in the glacier example. And they gradually make the soil more rich because they produce pine needles or leaves that will fall down, and those will be broken down, make the soil richer. And they also cool the area below them by shading. And then eventually those conditions become conducive to the taller trees, the sort of what you might think of as the K strategists, I suppose, the good competitors that grow tall, shade everything out, and eventually take over as the climax forest. So what we've talked about in these successions of communities is the fact that when a habitat becomes available, some species will move in and start to take over there. And they will modify the conditions there in some way that actually makes it more conducive for the next range of species to come in, etc. So you get these pioneer plants that facilitate the next group of species that come in. And these alders, which were also in the Glacier Bay example, nitrogen fixers, they enriched the soil. They made it or facilitated the next stage of these to move in. This made the soil more rich. They were outcompeted, and it facilitated these ones. But at each one of these stages, the new colonizers are inhibiting or competing in some way with the original ones. So this is making this easier, that cuts these out, that facilitates this way and inhibits that way, etc. Okay. So you go through this series of communities. The final thing I want to talk about in this lecture is this concept of regime shifts. So a regime shift is a rapid reorganization of a system from one relatively sort of stable state to another. So the system shifts between alternate stable states. And the way that theoretical ecologists sort of think about this can be sort of captured by these diagrams shown here. So you can sort of imagine these troughs and valleys as being sort of the stability of a different sort of set of communities that may exist. And if you're in this state here, on the left with this left ball, to go to another type of community regime, there's some sort of push that you need to go through that pushes you up this sort of theoretical hill until you roll down the other side into another stable condition. Okay, the ball's going to settle down here. Okay, And this push might be something like a disturbance within the system, such as like overfishing, for example, or something that's sort of disturbing the community in some way, or the ecosystem that they're living in. And then until you get a shift in this regime. So community is eventually suddenly going through this shift to this other, and it becomes stable here. Now, sometimes you get a reversal of conditions that might drive the ball in a theoretical context back towards its original state. This concept here, hysteresis, refers to the fact that sometimes there is a resistance to this, okay? You've got to go through a very big change or a big push that's going to push you all the way back up in this direction before eventually you revert to that original state. So it's like a flip-flop type of a condition when you have this resistance occurring, as opposed to a gradual transition between two states, okay? It can flip-flop suddenly. So that's just shown in a similar context here, where you have, this push that might be changing the community from one state to another could be a change in an environmental parameter. For example, conditions getting warmer over time, getting colder over time, or the salinity of the water changing, or the pH changing, or something like that. So you can either have a smooth transition like this, or maybe there's a threshold like this, but you can move in a sort of stable way or continuous way between these two regimes if you don't have big resistance or a big hill that you need to get over, basically, to them. But when you do have resistance, this is where you can get these flip-flop conditions. So what these two graphs are indicating here is that if you're in an original state and conditions are changing, maybe suddenly your community state, so that's the state of your community, the species composition, for example, is indicated on this y-axis. You go this way, this way, this way, and then suddenly you change, and all along here, once you change, you can exist in this condition. But to go back again, you've got to go further along this environmental parameter than when you actually flipped. You've got to go further back until you suddenly revert back to that original state. So this would be a small amount of resistance. This would indicate a bigger amount of resistance. You've got to go way, 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 way back all over here before suddenly you flip back up to this original state. So these regime shifts are important. They can be sort of seen where you get like the community dominated by a certain group of species, and an environmental change occurs, and suddenly the dominant species switch. A good example of this occurs, has been documented in Caribbean coral reefs. So this top right figure here shows a sea urchin called diadema, which is an important component of coral reefs. And what they're grazers. If you remember when we were doing the echinoderms, we showed the Aristotle's lantern that they use for rasping away at algae on hard surfaces. They graze over coral reefs and basically keep them clear of algae that might grow over the surface of them. And that allows the coral to survive. But in the 1980s, there was a mass mortality event of these diadema urchins because there was a disease that moved through the Caribbean. So there was a huge loss of these, which resulted in algal overgrowth of corals, and a lot of the corals died, and the system became dominated suddenly by this algal community. So it's a shift from this condition here and a flip to this algal dominated condition. Now, there has been some reversal in some areas, but it's a difficult reversal to undergo due to this resistance that you have in the system.
Is that different from coral bleaching?
Yeah, so coral bleaching is often related, for example, when you get high water temperatures, for example, unusually high water temperatures, where the coral, part of the coral's defense against that is that they lose the symbiotic dinoflagellates that live inside of them, that where they have a symbiosis where the dinoflagellates are photosynthesizing and releasing some nutrients to the coral, and the coral is respiring and providing carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. And then those corals become very unhealthy, and if they eventually die, then they can also be overgrown by algae. But that's different from this. This is a double stress basically when you lose these sea urchins from the system. So the final point in this is that species diversity within a community. So remember, we talked about diversity being species richness and as well as species evenness when we're talking about that index of diversity. Diversity can also affect community function because it can affect the stability and resilience to disturbance. So what does that mean? Like, resilience means that when you have a disturbance such as like a hurricane, for example, it's the ability of the system to sort of recover from some sort of big disturbance, okay, as opposed to just being decimated and not being able to get back quickly to its original state. So this is an example of an experiment that was done in, so what does it say, 120 plots. And what they did was, in this experiment, is they manipulated the number of species of grass that occurred in these different plots from 1 to 24. And what they showed was that when you have plots with more species, you get, on average, a higher degree of plant cover. And that's because over changing conditions, if you have a range of different species there, as conditions change from one state to another, you have a backup species that can take over in the case that your original dominant species can't do very well under those changed conditions. So you have a backup, basically, where there's always something else that can be sort of taking the space of something else that declines when you have a shift in conditions. And they also show that that has effects on not just plant cover, but actually the chemical composition of the soil. So this is an example of efficiency of nitrogen use. As you have more species, the nitrogen content of that soil goes down. And the reason for that is that when you have greater plant cover, there's more growth, more production going on. And so it's using the nutrients within that system. So you're actually changing the habitat conditions in addition to just having different species there, etc. Okay. Okay, and then we're on to the summary slide for that. So I will close that one down, and we will move on to the last PowerPoint of the semester. Okay, so this last one is on ecosystems, okay? Chapter 56 in the book. Now, just a reminder of this figure that we've used in the last few lectures. Okay, so what do we mean by an ecosystem? When we were talking about ecology in general, we talked about the range of different sizes, scales in ecology, and how ecology sort of integrates across these different scales, going from the individual level of an individual organism up to, the biosphere, Earth. We've just talked about communities, which consist of all of the different species living in an area and interacting in some way with one another. The ecosystem consists of the community, but also the area, the physical area that they're living in. So it's a community plus the physical and chemical environment. Okay, a wide range of spatial scales. So just like when we were talking about community, the boundaries of an ecosystem is kind of vague. And ecologists often focus on a subset of an ecosystem due to the complexity. So for example, they might be interested in the soil ecosystem, an estuarine ecosystem. So just in the same way that we talked about with communities, it's a little bit vague of what that scale exactly is, and people working on it need to kind of define what that system is they're working on, because there's no, it's a sliding scale, it's not a one or the other. And often, so ecosystem science is the study of energy flow and nutrient cycling within this system. So, this is the physical and chemical environment. So it's looking at how these processes are occurring with respect to the communities that live there. So as a reminder, so energy and nutrients flow through biotic and abiotic environments. If we think of energy flow through a system, primary production is obviously the important sort of starting point here, where you have the synthesis of organic compounds from atmospheric and aqueous carbon dioxide. So sunlight is our ultimate source here in most systems of primary production, leading to the production of carbohydrates, etc. within here. Secondary production is then generation of heterotrophic or consumer biomass. So biomass meaning sort of biological mass of things. So energy is being transferred from the sun into these primary producers, and then it's transferring through food webs, which we've discussed previously, into these secondary producers. Okay. And nutrients are cycling in the same way. Okay. So as chemicals get incorporated into primary production, they get passed through the secondary producers, and ultimately those will then be recycled in some form or manner through the physical environment by decomposition and breaking down of those biological chemicals. Okay. So some of the macronutrients involved in this is carbon, obviously. So carbon dioxide going into carbohydrates, which is our sort of energy storage, and then other organic compounds from that. Hydrogen and nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And then there are some other sort of micronutrients that are required by biological organisms in much smaller concentrations. So iron, for example, for oxygen transport in our blood, and then other micronutrients that might be used, for example, in enzyme processes, but only needed in very small amounts. Okay. Now, one thing I didn't mention here when we're talking about energy flow is that energy doesn't flow seamlessly from one level to the other. There is a loss of energy due to metabolic loss of heat from one trophic level through to another. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a slide taken from a much earlier chapter in the book, this table here. And it's just reminding us about how primary production occurs. It can occur through photosynthesis or through chemosynthesis. Okay, so most of the carbon that is being fixed into biological chemicals on Earth is occurring due to photosynthesis through these photoautotrophs, such as plants, for example, fixing carbon dioxide. But also remember, there are some situations that we discussed, such as in deep sea hydrothermal vents, where instead of the energy from light being the source that's driving this primary production, you can have chemical energy from bacteria, for example, that is also fixing carbon dioxide. So some of these deep sea hydrothermal vents, and there are some other systems as well, that basically can fix carbon without sunlight. But most of what's occurring is occurring through photosynthesis. So, as I just mentioned here, photosynthesis accounts for the vast majority of global primary production. And this primary production can be quantified, and this is often a term of interest, basically. And it's typically quantified in terms of the mass of carbon that is fixed. So in other words, converted from carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. And so this can be measured in terms of, for example, grams of carbon per meter squared per year, which should be referred to as productivity, or the production, the amount of carbon that is sitting within a certain meter square. Now, sometimes these terms are used a little interchangeably, so you just need to be careful about what they're sort of specifically referring to. In terms of global primary production, you can have the gross primary production, which is the GPP, and this refers to the total amount of carbon that is being fixed. And also there's the net primary production, and that refers to the gross primary production minus that carbon that's lost through respiration, so minus that energy that is being used for respiration and partly released as heat, etc. And the net primary production is what ultimately gives rise to the growth or biomass of an organism or its reproductive output. So net primary production is gross primary production minus that's lost through respiration. So how does that net primary production vary on a global scale? I'll just remind you of a couple of slides that we've had from previous lectures that influence this process. First of all, when we're talking about the physical environment, we had this slide that basically shows two things: that temperatures vary by latitude, because sunlight that is warming the Earth at low latitudes near the equator, it covers a smaller area of land than if you're at high latitudes, where it's spread out over a larger area of the land. Also, it passes through less distance through the atmosphere than when it hits obliquely. So global variation in temperatures. Metabolic rate is related to temperature, so that can affect rate of metabolism. Secondly, we also talked about how rainfall patterns vary on a global scale in a general sense. Where you have high heating of the equator, you get rising of hot, moist air, and as it rises, it cools, results in very high rainfall. Then you get these Hadley cells that circulate with the descending air around 30 degrees north and south, where you have dry conditions, so deserts, etc. And then other circulating patterns as well, so high rainfall at these mid-latitudes, desert areas at the poles. So variation in wetness and in temperatures on a global scale. We also talked about these Walter climate diagrams that relate to growth, when growth occurs in different types of systems. So for example, if we refer to this one in the tropics, where we have high temperatures, but also very high precipitation, this precipitation line is above the temperature line, that means high growth vegetation, for example, in those areas. In the desert areas, precipitation is very low, temperature is very high, and that is not conducive to growth. And in some areas, such as tundra, where you have a lot of the time of the year it's less than 0 degrees Celsius, that's also not conducive to growth. So variation in growth potential in these different regions of the world. So how does that relate to global patterns of net primary productivity? Okay, we remember that's the gross productivity minus that loss through respiration. So net primary productivity on land accounts for about 52% of global net primary productivity, the rest being in oceans. And in general, what you find is that as the average annual precipitation of an area increases, the net primary productivity increases as well, okay, related to that fact that it's better conditions for growth. However, at extremely high average annual precipitation rates, this actually declines ultimately. And that's related to a couple of factors. One of them is that when you have very, very high rainfall, there's lots of leaching of nutrients out of the soil being washed away. And that becomes a limiting factor to primary productivity. The other is that when you have like super high rainfall, you have really high cloud coverage, and that blocks out the sunlight. So you start reducing that ability for photosynthesis. And then in temperatures, you get a general increase with temperature, because the higher temperatures mean higher metabolic rates, faster turnover of the system, and faster capacity for growth. So how does that relate to this global scale that we were talking about? This is the global patterns of net primary productivity. And what this graph is showing here is it's showing latitude. So in the middle here, this would be the equator, 0 degrees. This is going through to the north as you move this direction. And as you move in this direction, you're going towards the south. Now, there are 3 lines that are shown on this figure. So we'll start with this green one, which is terrestrial net primary productivity. Okay, so that's occurring on land. And you can see that it's highest in this equatorial region right here. Okay, so that fits in with our expectation that in the around the equator you get very high rainfall and you get high temperatures, which relates to that high productivity. That's relating to this graph up here, basically. Tropical rainforests, high precipitation, and high temperatures. As you move away, this, for example, around 30 degrees is where you're going to get those really dry areas. Okay, it's a bit cooler, but it's very dry where these deserts are occurring in some regions of the world at these 30-degree areas. And so you get this decline in productivity, and then a secondary peak that occurs later on, where you get, remember at those mid-latitudes, you get areas of higher rainfall again that fit in with that, okay? So you get this like small peak, a decline, and then a big major peak here. Now you notice in the southern hemisphere, it's a little bit different, and the main reason for that is there's far less land cover in the southern hemisphere, okay? A much greater amount of ocean there. Okay, so the second graph that we got here is this blue one here. Now, what this is showing is that the variation on a latitudinal basis, it's much less compared to the terrestrial variation. The reason why this is not so high at around the equator is, although there's a lot of light and ocean and it's warm in that area, other things can be limiting primary productivity, especially the fact that these areas around the equator might run out of nutrients because you get a so-called thermal stratification of the water column. You get hot water building up from the surface that doesn't mix very well with waters below it. And so nutrients in that thermal layer at the top get depleted quite quickly. And that starts to limit primary productivity. At these mid-latitude areas, there's more mixing that goes on. So there's a little bit of a sort of secondary peak that is occurring around some of these mid-latitudes. And in the Southern Ocean, you have a much larger area of ocean as well that's occurring there. And then this green line is basically showing, the orange line is basically showing the two of these together, this sort of global variation. So it's a mixture of these two things added together. Highest net productivity at the equator, and then some secondary peaks at mid-latitudes. Oceans less variable. Okay, this is just showing what I've just said. Okay, and then if you look at a map of that, in terms of the ocean scale, this is explaining some of the processes that are going on within this that sort of add extra complexity to the system. So net primary production in the ocean is about 48% of global net primary production. And so here you can see on this graph, a darker color in the ocean indicates lower productivity, and the brighter colors indicates higher levels of net primary productivity. And here, for example, you can see that slightly increased net primary productivity at these mid-latitudes compared to equatorial regions, okay, that we discussed. But what's also much more evident in here is that the net primary productivity is very concentrated around these coastal regions, okay? And the reason for that is that, now I mentioned that in the oceans, primary productivity can be limited by nutrients. In some of these areas, particularly on the western sides of continents, you have upwelling. Okay, we discussed that in a previous lecture as well, where deep water comes up that has nutrients with it and can replenish nutrient levels at these shallower depths that light is able to penetrate to, where primary production is occurring primarily due to microscopic phytoplankton. Also around these coastal areas, you have a lot of runoff. So erosion, for example, from soils and rocks, not socks, and running down in rivers. And as they flow out into the ocean, you have high nutrient levels that is generating this primary productivity in coastal areas. So two different processes that are going on there that are very important for primary productivity. This is just a table now. It's got a little information in it, and I'm not going to go through everything on this. I just want to highlight some points that this diagram from the book is making. Okay, so ecosystems differ in their net primary production, and what is shown in these three separate columns here is that one of them is the percent of Earth's surface area occupied by different types of ecosystems. And right at the top here, you see that there's open ocean, okay? 65% of Earth's surface, and actually this break here indicates that that line is way off the scale there. The next biggest is continental shelf, okay? So that sort of bit of shallower area around the edges of continents in the ocean, 5.2%. Tropical rainforest, only 3.3%, okay? So lots of area, very little area. Upwelling areas, only 0.01%, okay, of the Earth's surface. This second column is showing the average net primary productivity in these different systems, okay? So although the ocean is huge, its net primary productivity is actually very low, okay, in those areas compared to something like a tropical rainforest where you have extremely high net primary productivity because you've got lots of rainfall, you've got high temperatures, etc., okay, generating this high productivity. So in this final column, when you consider the percent of Earth's total net primary productivity, it's basically a combination of these two factors. So the vast amount of net primary productivity, or the biggest proportion, is coming from oceans, even though they actually have a very low grams per meter squared per year net primary productivity. They're huge. So when you multiply this by this, even though net primary productivity is small, the overall production is big because of their area. Rainforests, you have a very high net primary productivity, pretty small area, but you combine them together and you get a big net primary production. Okay, so that's just making the point that your overall production on a global scale is going to depend on two things: how much area you've got, and what is the rate of the process going on in those different areas. Okay, so what are the limits to net primary productivity? What we're going to consider is whether climate conditions, CO2, and nutrient availability can affect net primary productivity. So we've talked about climate conditions already, right? So precipitation and temperature, for example. Let's consider the CO2 and nutrient availability. And in particular, can an increased net primary productivity offset carbon dioxide emissions that are occurring on a global scale that lead to concerns over changes in global temperatures and warming conditions and things like that? Okay, if we can, you might expect that under higher carbon dioxide levels, you would get higher net primary productivity, because this is the raw material for sugars to be made in plants through primary productivity. There was a really large-scale experiment in North Carolina they did to address this, and there's been a number of other experiments throughout the world as well, looking at this concept, because it's obviously of interest. If you can sort of offset, if we can put carbon dioxide into the air and carry on doing that, but not worrying about it because it's just going to be soaked up by net primary productivity. So this one experiment, the so-called FACE experiment, the free air carbon dioxide enrichment, what they did was in these forests, they set up a whole series of plots where they had these huge towers that were pumping carbon dioxide into this enclosed area. Okay, and they had different plots putting in different amounts of carbon dioxide. And within the area, they had little carbon dioxide sensors. So there was a feedback loop, so it could monitor, and you could get to the carbon dioxide level that you wanted to maintain. When it reached that, it would cut off this carbon dioxide supply. If it got depleted, it would turn them back on again. So this was like a sort of a monitored system, basically. And these are the results that they found, because they didn't just do a treatment of carbon dioxide enrichment. They also did some plots where they either put fertilizer in the forest or added no fertilizer, just as you'd put fertilizer on some crops or something like that, right? And the question is, well, which of these was the limiting factor? So here we've got the day of the year, so this is time basically, and this is showing the cumulative woody tissue, productivity basically that's going on, or production actually in this case. And so this red line here is showing what is happening if you have elevated CO2, so you're increasing CO2 and you're fertilizing the system as well. You get this really sort of higher production that's going on within the system. Now this blue line shows what happens if you elevate the CO2 but you do not fertilize it. You basically see that the production is much smaller, and in fact it's very similar to this orange line, which is what you get if you have just the normal background level of CO2 that is unfertilized. So this is indicating that yes, CO2 can lead to greater production, but only if you have a fertilized system, only if it's because the fertilizer is the limiting step within it. Okay, you can see if you only fertilize something, you actually get quite a big lot more production that's going on, just as you do on your farm crops. You're not putting more carbon dioxide on them, you're just giving them more, nitrogen mostly, perhaps phosphorus. Okay, so in other words, the sort of take-home message from this is that unless you're going to fertilize the entire world, this is not going to offset carbon dioxide that we're pumping out into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's obviously an impractical approach, and it will not offset. So what about the factors controlling net primary productivity in surface waters? So in surface waters, nutrients are typically the limiting factors for net primary productivity. In ocean systems, in most cases, or in many cases, nitrogen is the limiting factor. So nitrogen is a major macronutrient that we need, and it's used for example, synthesizing proteins as part of proteins. And it's often limiting in coastal areas and oceans. So this figure here, for example, shows this is the Gulf of Mexico. This is Louisiana here, and you've got the Mississippi running down in this area here. The Mississippi brings massive amounts of nutrients with it. And part of this has become a real problem in recent decades because it actually brings excess nutrients because of runoff from fertilizers that are put way, throughout the Mississippi basin onto farmland. And so you get this really high primary productivity indicated by these red areas from the satellite image that's effectively showing chlorophyll density. Because this nitrogen, these nitrogen compounds are flowing out into this area. And this has actually become problematic because the nitrogen output is so high that it leads to such high primary productivity that a large proportion of that phytoplankton that's produced, instead of being eaten by zooplankton, it dies and settles to the seabed where it's consumed by oxygen, by bacteria that use oxygen in that process and creates anoxic areas or dead zones where fish and benthic organisms can't survive there. Now, in other areas, iron, surprisingly, is a limiting factor. This occurs particularly in equatorial parts of the Pacific and in the Southern Ocean, this giant bit of ocean in the southern hemisphere that circles the entire globe because there's no intervening landmass. And the way that this has been demonstrated is that ships have gone out and enriched the ocean with different sort of types of either macro or micronutrients, and then looked at what happens to primary productivity. There was a whole series of these iron ones done in equatorial Pacific and Southern Ocean in the 1990s. This is an example of a satellite image where a vessel has gone along this track, and as it's moved along, it's been pumping iron compounds into the ocean. And then these bright colors show chlorophyll levels, so primary productivity. And so from doing this with different types of chemicals, they were able to show that iron is the limiting factor. When you add extra iron into the ocean, suddenly primary productivity goes through the roof because that was the component that was limiting the production that was occurring there. Now, when you go to freshwater systems, they often work in a different way. And in freshwater systems, such as lakes and rivers, phosphorus is, in many cases, the limiting nutrient. So this is needed for many metabolic functions. So, you know, it's an ATP, DNA, sugar phosphate backbones, etc., and in, you know, the phospholipids of all of our membranes. Okay, so phosphorus is an important component of our biomass, and the importance of this was demonstrated in the late 1960s through a series of experiments on large lakes, where they either fertilized entire lakes, or, as in this case, they split a lake into two and put, you know, treated one section in one way and another section in another way, and looked at the primary productivity that occurred there. So, for example, in this experiment here, you can see this water is clear water where there is low primary production going on. This is a darker, this is a sort of richer, greener color where there is a lot of productivity going on. So what does it say? This section was treated only with carbon and nitrogen and remained clear. So primary productivity did not increase substantially when you added nitrogen, as it might do in a coastal area. This section was treated with a combination of phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon. So you've added phosphorus to this now. And it underwent a massive bloom of cyanobacteria. So massive increase in primary productivity. And this is, you know, reinforced by the fact that sewage, for example, when you get a lot of sewage running into lakes and rivers, etc., you get this problem. And it's a massive problem in many, many areas where sewage or fertilizer runoff or something like that leads to this so-called eutrophication. Okay, too much nutrients going into the system to the point where not all the secondary consumers can consume it, and it takes over, and it either dies and creates anoxia as bacteria break it down, or before that occurs, you still get anoxic conditions, because during the daytime, these photosynthesizers, they're releasing oxygen as part of photosynthesis. So you get nutrient-rich waters, but at nighttime, they're not photosynthesizing. But you have a massive amount of cells there, all you know, respiring. So they actually use the oxygen. So oxygen levels go up in the day, and then they go way down at nighttime. They oscillate up and down on a daily scale. So bottom line here is phosphorus is often limiting in freshwater systems. Nitrogen is often limiting in ocean or coastal systems, but iron is limiting in some situations, such as the equatorial Pacific and the Southern Ocean. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the transfer of energy, so food webs and the transfer of energy from primary producers to consumers. Okay, we've talked about primary production already quite a lot. Secondary production is the generation of heterotrophic or consumer biomass. So those organisms that are consuming the primary producers and then predators within that system, etc. How much energy is transferred from primary production to secondary production? The amount of that will depend on a number of different steps, and one of them is the consumption efficiency, the amount of plant biomass that is consumed. So obviously, if you're only consuming a tiny proportion of what is actually there, then not much of it will go to secondary production. Where if you're consuming all of it, then potentially a lot of it can go into secondary production. Okay. Once you've consumed something, the assimilation efficiency then comes into play. That is the amount of ingested plant biomass that is digested and then taken into your system, so it can be used by you. Whereas, you know, some of that is going to be lost in feces, so it's just not digested, so it's never available to you, it just passes through you. And then also there's some loss through urine as well. And then at the last step, there's the production efficiency, which is the amount of digested plant biomass that is converted to new biomass. Now remember, some of the energy is lost through metabolism and respiration, okay, as heat leaving the system. It's not a perfectly efficient system. Energy that we intake, some of it we lose inadvertently. Okay? Not all of it will go towards growth of new biomass. So this slide is just showing that in a schematic way, where you have net primary productivity. Some of that is not consumed, so that's the consumption efficiency, okay? And a proportion of it is consumed, although, well, strictly speaking, that is the consumption efficiency. So you can consume some of it's lost through feces and urine, some of it is assimilated, so it's digested and made available within the body for use. And then the production efficiency refers to that component that then goes into growth of new sort of stuff, you know, us, versus that component that we've lost through respiration. Okay, consumption efficiency, assimilation efficiency, and production efficiency. This slide is talking about the variation that occurs amongst organisms in their production efficiency. In the slides that you got, I think it says table 57.1. I've updated that to 56.1 because that's the chapter numbers have changed within the books. Okay. The point being made here is that if you look at this production efficiency, so once you've assimilated food, how much of it gets produced, changed into secondary production, amount of carbon, of biomass. Okay. Endotherms typically have a lower production efficiency than ectotherms. Okay, see these numbers here, like 3 to 1% versus, you know, these much higher percentages here. Why is that? The reason is that these endotherms have much higher metabolic rates because they're acting as endotherms. Okay, they're generating, they're respiring and generating heat so that they can maintain a body temperature. So there's a much greater loss of energy through that process, through the respiration that's occurring, and a much smaller proportion of it is being transferred into biomass. Within this, there is also variation depending upon animal size. So in general, you get a higher production efficiency with very large animals than with very small animals. The reason for that is that larger animals typically have a lower metabolic rate per unit mass than those smaller organisms. So if you're a very tiny bird, for example, and trying to maintain a constant body temperature, you have a much higher surface area to volume ratio. In other words, you're cooling down much quicker, and therefore you've got to have a higher metabolic rate to be able to compensate for that, versus something that's very large where you're retaining heat better. Also, part of this process is that when you're very small, it's also a sort of oxygen supply to tissue sort of issue that as you become larger and larger becomes a limiting factor. But a secondary size factor within that, on top of the fact that, you know, whether you're an endotherm versus an ectotherm is having a big effect on your production efficiency. So the ultimate product of that is essentially how much biomass occurs at different trophic levels. So, and this can vary between different types of systems. And so the amount of biomass at different trophic levels varies between ecosystems. Trophic efficiency, I added that in from the slides that you got, is the energy at one trophic level divided by the energy below it. So what's the relative difference between these different levels, for example? So let's start off with looking at forest ecosystems. There are two different diagrams here. The one on the left refers to the energy flow. So in other words, how many calories are passing through the system per unit area per day. Now this one here is what we're looking at, which is the biomass. How much actual, you know, if you go up out to a forest and sort of and weigh how much different biomasses in primary producers versus secondary producers, etc. Okay, going up the food web, the different trophic levels. In forest, the majority of biomass is tied up in wood. Okay, so most of it is in these primary producers, because a large proportion of that is being put into very resilient types of carbohydrates, such as lignin, for example, that the average primary consumer can't go and consume, except for a few special instances, such as termites, for example. Okay, so a lot of it is locked. The biomass is locked up in these primary producers. If you go to something like a grassland, okay, you get a higher component of that in your primary consumers. So more energy is available to the herbivores within the system, so the more of it is being passed and retained at these higher trophic levels. So most of the biomass in grassland is found in plants, but more energy is available to herbivores than in the forest. So a difference between the standing biomass in these two different systems. And then if you go to the open ocean ecosystem, you get this sort of strange situation where actually a larger amount of this energy and biomass is contained not amongst the primary producers, but amongst those organisms that are feeding directly upon them. So these primary producers are generating energy. The energy flow is very high within them. The difference is that most of these are tiny microscopic phytoplankton that only live for a very short period of time and have very, very high turnover rates. So these things are like, going extremely fast and rapidly, but they're consumed rapidly by the next trophic level within them. And so most of that actual biomass is contained at the trophic level above them. Okay. So what does it say here? The primary producers in the ocean are phytoplankton, which reproduce so rapidly that a small standing biomass can support a much larger biomass of herbivores. Okay, so that's what I just said basically. So bottom line here is that there are differences between ecosystems in terms of their standing biomass at different trophic levels, depending upon the particular circumstances in these different types of ecosystems. And when you think of trophic food webs and the energy flowing between them, you can have different types of control of those food webs. Is what is controlling the amount of energy flowing between them and the standing biomass in different components of those trophic levels. One of the types of controls, and there's two types that we'll discuss here, and in reality, both of these types of controls are operating. It's a relative balance between them that varies between systems. So one of the controls is bottom-up control. This is where the control of the trophic food web is being controlled from the bottom, and particularly from the nutrient supply and primary productivity within the system. So an example of this is the open oceans, where we showed before that if you enrich them with iron, for example, or nitrogen along the coasts, you get this great big increase in primary productivity. They've got more capacity. They've got capacity to go at a higher rate than they are in many instances if you add extra nutrients to the system. And so that's why where you get these upwelling areas, for example, this is some of the highest fishery production in the world comes from these upwelling areas in places like Peru, off Angola, etc. Because you've got this super high productivity that is being controlled by nutrients being supplied into the system. Another type of control comes from so-called top-down control. Okay, and this is where the higher trophic levels are exerting a pressure on the lower ones and affecting the production in those different systems. So a good example of this is the keystone species that we've talked about before, in terms of that lynx hair cycle in Canada, where you have predation from the lynx controlling hair numbers. And we talked about in Yellowstone, where wolves have a major effect on elk numbers, which then has a knock-on effect upon the vegetation, such as the willows, which then has a knock-on effect upon the beavers that use those, etc. And then this sea otter example that we've discussed a number of times, where the sea otters are predating upon urchins, which then eat all the algae, or the kelp bed, sorry, which then provide habitat for fish, etc. So here it's coming from the top predators within the system, exerting pressure on lower trophic levels. So how many different trophic levels exist within a system? Okay, many food webs have 3 to 4 trophic levels. Okay, that seems to be a sort of fairly typical level. Occasionally, you might get 5 or more, but that's very rare. What exactly controls this is not fully resolved, and there's probably a number of different things that are controlling it, and a number of different hypotheses. One of the key things, of course, is that energy is lost as you go from one trophic level to another. Okay, the respiration's occurring and getting lost within that. And so a typical value that's used is 10% occurs as you go up each level, and there's obviously a finite level of steps you can go through before you start getting something that's functionally would work. So other hypotheses relate to so loss of energy up the system, ecosystem size. So for example, in very large lakes, you get more trophic levels than you do in lower trophic levels. The amount of disturbance, when you have extremely high disturbance, you get, so disturbance being a change in conditions that kills some of the community, you get loss of the small number of large predators that can change the system. And some evolutionary constraints. So the hypothesis behind that is that, if you take a tiger, for example, now, what can evolve to take out a tiger? I don't know if there's any evidence to support that, but it's a sort of working hypothesis that some people are interested in. But basically, a range of different hypotheses, probably more than one of them is coming into effect. Okay. So the final one part I want to talk about, and these were the homework videos that I gave you to look at. Let's see, we've got about 7 minutes left, so we'll do the best we can here. Is that we mentioned that ecosystem biologists are interested in nutrient cycling within the system. So nutrient cycling involves chemical and biological transformation. These are called biogeochemical cycles because they involve geology, so chemicals locked up in rocks, for example, chemistry, obviously, and biological processes that can modify these. So nutrients, such as nitrogen, for example, can be uptaken by autotrophs, so photosynthetic organisms, for example. They get passed on to things that consume them, detritus, so the recycling, and then they can be broken down by bacteria and fungi and detritivores and back into the system. Some of those might be mineralized or go into the atmosphere, etc. So cycling of nutrients within the system. These are the 5 main cycles they talk about in the book. We won't talk about phosphorus and sulfur cycling, but we'll talk about water, carbon, and nitrogen cycling as best as possible. Okay. So with the water cycle, this is something that people are sort of generally familiar with. Basically, the vast amount of water is locked up in the ocean. So these little boxes tell you about the amount of water that's sort of standing in these different components from the oceans, atmosphere, ice and snow, so that's a large amount there, and groundwater is a large amount there, okay? And these are cycling because you get evaporation from the ocean, large amount, this is the rate at which it's occurring, and a large proportion of that goes precipitation back into the ocean, simply because the oceans are so large. Some of that is transported over land, where precipitation occurs. A proportion of that goes back in from evaporation and transpiration, so the loss of water through the leaves of plants. Some of it is runoff in rivers back to the ocean, but a proportion of that goes down into the groundwater, okay? So you've basically got this sort of cycling that's going on, and all of these different components have different so-called residency times, okay, within this. So the average residence time vary greatly between major compartments. Water within an organism might have a residency time of only a week. If a water molecule comes into me, on average, according to this, it would be within me for a week. Whereas in the ocean, your residency time, if you land up in the ocean, you're likely to be there for a good 3,000 years or so before you then go somewhere else within this system. So these average residency times, they vary greatly between these different components. Groundwater is generally locked in, so very long residency time of about 10,000 years. Antarctic ice sheets, 20,000 years. So when we're having big effects upon these, either by extracting lots of groundwater from aquifers for our own use, or depleting these through melting ice due to warming conditions, that has a major effect upon these, because ordinarily their residence times would be much, much longer. Okay, that's the video that I gave you earlier. I had a link in there from the previous book. This video works if you click on it within the PowerPoint, but also it's animation 56.2 in the ebook, okay? Okay, so we've got very quick time to go through the carbon side, global carbon cycle, okay? So the vast majority of carbon is stored in fossil fuels, rocks, and seawater, okay? These different boxes show the amount that's locked within these different components of the system. Okay, so let me think here, because we're sort of getting close on time here. Okay, 1:27. I'm going to leave you to watch the video as your homework on this thing. And the aspect I want to talk about here is how global carbon has varied over time. So I mentioned that water is locked within ice sheets for very long periods of time. Well, sometimes that's extremely long, okay? And if you go to parts of Greenland and Antarctica, you can take ice cores that go back in time up to 800,000 years. And what people are interested in from these ice cores is to look at the carbon dioxide levels that have existed in the atmosphere at different points in time going back, okay? And the reason why you can do that is these ice cores have got tiny micro bubbles within them, and you can extract those micro bubbles and measure the carbon dioxide concentration within them. And what they show is that carbon dioxide levels, indicated by these red lines, have varied over time in geological time, okay? Some points they were really high, some points they were really low. Now, you can also look at oxygen isotopes, and they can act as a proxy for the temperature that existed at that time. That's indicated by this black line. And that shows that they vary in a very similar manner to carbon dioxide. Okay, and that makes total sense because if you remember, when we talked about the physical environment, carbon dioxide, so energy arrives from the sun, it warms up the land and then is reflected back as infrared radiation, and that wavelength is absorbed by carbon dioxide, and that's what creates that warming effect within the atmosphere. So, you know, this is obviously the sort of pattern that we're concerned about with recent changes in carbon dioxide. This here is a figure showing or emphasizing the changes that have occurred in carbon dioxide in just recent years since the Industrial Revolution. So recent in terms of the last 800,000 years. And we're at a way higher level than we have been for almost 1 million years, basically. So today's, I updated this as well, this amount. We're at 417 parts per million now, changing all the time. There's a website that shows you what that level is, okay? Okay, we are at 1:30. This is our cutoff slide for final exams, right? The global carbon cycle. I will make that clear in the notes that I circulate with you. There's about another 5 slides or so left within this, covering the nitrogen cycle, but I will not include those in the final exam, okay? And good, so thank you all for being here. Thank you, yeah, for sticking right through to the end. And we will have a review session tomorrow if you're able to turn up to that, which would be great. And don't forget to go to the review, you know, the lecture reviews that you get, where you can do reviews, you can say what you like, things you don't like, you can mention those and how you might, you know, things that you might think of to improve them, if that's, you know, the way that you feel. Just be constructive. Great. Thank you very much indeed then. Yes, I will record the review session, okay, in answer to you, is that Thomas or somebody asked that, but I will review it. And record it, that's what I'm saying. Will I use the same link tomorrow? I will put up a new Blackboard Collaborate Ultra link for the session. I will not be available for office hours this afternoon though, unfortunately, because I have an appointment. But if you need to speak to me, you can email me and we can arrange something, okay? But I will put up a new Blackboard Collaborate Ultra link for the review session.